I'm driving up to the Scottish borders, but first passing through the village of Bewcastle to tell the story of the once fluid border between these two different kingdoms. Within these constantly moving lines, a number of border clans refused to accept legal authority from either England or Scotland, forming an ungovernable land where only the strong survived. This land came to be known as the Debatable land. The cross in the center of this village has been called by some the best example of Anglo-Saxon art in history, and it marks the spot of a Roman fort, an outpost of Hadrian's Wall, now barely visible, a Roman wall that divided what is now mostly England from Scotland. When the Romans left, the Saxon warlords moved in. The runes on the face of the cross tell the stories of ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Northumbria and Mercia. This is well on the English side of the border, in Cumbria. Still, if you walk up to the War Memorial, you'll see Scottish names, particularly those of the Armstrongs. The fact that this family and many others associated with the Debatable lands even became associated with Scotland is only by historic chance. For centuries, they refused to obey the orders of the Scottish crown, but that didn't make them friends with the English either. They launched regular raids into the southern areas of England below the unclear borders of the Debatable lands, mustering thousands of clansmen to rustle cattle and extort money from the farmers. Many of them settled in Cumbria and even further south. They would then return to the lawless hills of the Debatable lands, untouchable, at least for now. Law didn't apply here, outside of what the Armstrongs and some other powerful clans could provide. To really start this tour of what most tourists would consider the borderlands, we drive up close to Lockerbie. When I visited the first time, I came from the north, passing to England before looping back into Scotland, glad to see I wasn't being corralled into some sort of border checkpoint, at least not yet. The first stop here is the Armstrongs' ancestral stronghold in Gilnockie Tower. It was originally built in the early 16th century by Johnny Armstrong, a famous border reiver who used it to command his band of border thieves and rustlers. It lies to the west bank of the River Esk, which used to mark the start of the Debatable lands in this part of the country. Only 10 years after its creation, in 1530, King James V executed Johnny Armstrong and 50 of his men in an act of treachery, after which the tower fell into disrepair after a series of English raids in the 1540s. From that time on, Clan Armstrong usually sided more strongly with the Scots. The tower was in a ruin by the 1970s, but lengthy repairs brought it back to date, and since 1978, it's become a replica of a clan chief home, emphasizing Johnny Armstrong and another Armstrong they came to love, Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. One of the defining moments for this tower was a visit by Neil, which I was told by the Armstrong woman in the visitor center. Speaking of which, I should mention her a little bit. She had an unmistakable American accent, and I found out that she was born in Texas, actually from the same city I graduated boot camp in. She spoke with pride about how many Scottish folks would go on to immigrate to America and form the unique American Scots culture there. In our brief talks about American and Scottish history, we talked a little bit about the rivalries on the border. The Armstrongs from one area were friendly to all Armstrongs, but border clans still have inter-family rivalries, and she even mentioned that the Lockerbie Armstrongs, just miles away, had an apprehensive attitude to outsiders like herself and even to other Armstrongs from different parts of the country. They would show up to events and commemorate their ancestors, but some clans would never stick around for very long, even in the modern era. She then mentioned Johnny Armstrong. I hadn't heard of this man before, but she directed me to a gravesite just down the road that she assured me was his. She also set me on the Border Raider Trail, following in the footsteps of the Border Raiders, which she argues were 100 times more extreme than the cowboys of the American West. This was a bit of an odd stop. She pointed me down the road, past some fields, and to a cemetery set off from the main road, next to a farm. I found some surprisingly old graves bearing the insignia of other border clans, but no grave marker for Johnny. This cemetery was also just a couple hundred feet away from the English border. She told me this would have been the location of his real grave, near an old lost border tower, but that it was obscured and forgotten in favor of a memorial at a church quite a ways away. I was now on the Reaver Trail, though, and I'd visit the other churchyard tomorrow to tell the story of the rebel Johnny Armstrong. This churchyard is the more romanticized setting for Johnny Armstrong's execution, the Callan-Rig Chapel. He and his band of 160 rebels would attack Scotland when England was in the ascendancy, and England when Scotland was rising. His raids became so gruesome that the Archbishop of Glasgow excommunicated him in 1528, simply for making the Scottish crown look weak, unable to enforce the law on the border. Treacherously, King James V promised Armstrong and his men safe conduct in exchange for their peace, but hanged the leader and 36 of his followers in 1530, supposedly around this churchyard. Legend says that the trees refused to grow on the ground surrounding the churchyard where the double crossing took place. From that point on, the Armstrong family leaned more heavily toward the Scottish side of the border, but still were very wary of them. After all, they had been excommunicated just a few years prior, and it seemed to be that the Scottish aristocracy was siding with the English in some cases, like the murder of Johnny Armstrong. Not far from this churchyard is another proud monument to the history of Clan Armstrong, the Milhome Cross, one of the clan's most sacred relics. This is the first monument anywhere in Scotland to an Armstrong, specifically to Alexander Armstrong, killed at Hermitage Castle at around 1300, and likely buried underneath it. The deeper you look into the Milhome Cross, the more you begin to realize that it starts telling the story of such a deep and long-running conflict involving pretenders to the Scottish throne and attempts to even return Scotland to England. It becomes a fascinating sight, and the cross itself overlooks the English border on the opposite side of the valley. Alexander Armstrong was murdered by the de Soulles family in 1300, a part of a grand conspiracy. This family was considered to be so evil by those in the Scottish borders that they have their own folklore all around them. I'll detail some about William, who was likely the son of a man who killed Alexander Armstrong. He began in support of England, but switched his support to Scotland after Bruce won at the Battle of Bannockburn. By 1330, he was embroiled in a conspiracy from his castle on the borders, a place called Hermitage, still steeped in sort of evil folklore. Some believe he wanted to be king for himself, but most think he was trying to install Balliol as King of Scotland, a family which basically sought to hand the country over to the English, and because of this were wildly unpopular and only ever very successful in the border regions. One of the family relatives of William was Nicholas de Soulles, a very obscure competitor for the Scottish crown, and much like Balliol, was promptly forgotten to history. So evil was this family that when one of them at Hermitage was discovered in a conspiracy to overthrow the Scottish king and replace him with Edward Balliol, the locals had finally had enough of their cruelty. It's said that they stormed the gates of the capital and wrapped evil Lord Souls in lead, slowly boiling him alive near a local stone circle. Those in the borderlands began to rumor about Hermitage Castle. Within its walls, they said, the de Soulles family was being taught the dark arts by the Wizard of the North, an astrologer named Michael Scott, advisor to Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Scott, who schooled evil Lord Souls in dark magic, was said to have turned a coven of witches to stone, and they became Longmeg and her daughters, another ancient stone monument close to the Scottish borders. Immediately after his death, he gained a reputation like Aleister Crowley, being depicted in a deep circle of hell by Dante, reserved only for sorcerers and magicians who gained fame through cunning and lies. Back to William de Soulles, it was said that as punishment for his cruelty, before being boiled alive in lead, he was cursed with a familiar named Robin Redcap, a demon which plagued the surrounding villages, exacerbating William's reputation in the lead-up to his plot to install Edward Balliol as King of Scotland. It's said that a redcap haunts every abandoned castle in the Scottish borderlands, even to this day. Speaking of Edward Balliol, I should tell a little bit of his story, which is very interesting. When people think of Scottish kings and heroes, they usually think of William Wallace or Robert the Bruce, but they hardly ever think of the Balliol family. This starts with the death of Margaret, Maid of Norway. Following this, there was a power vacuum, and many people threw their hats into the ring to become King of Scotland. John Balliol had practically no support, but he was put forward by King Edward I of England with the hopes that he would turn Scotland into a satellite state. John Balliol was so hated that he was deposed by other Scottish nobility for handing the country to England, and the nobility ruled behind the curtain with the Council of 12, essentially rendering Scotland without a king and everything but on paper. Eventually, Balliol fell out of favor with Edward I, who wanted to rule directly, and by now was demanding tribute and coercing John to declare him the Lord of Scotland. Eventually he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. He was treated well and eventually released to France, where he faded into obscurity. When his son Edward came back to Scotland, the Scottish people were already wary and unamused with their games. Some on the border, like the de Soulles family, felt loyalty to the English crown and wanted a sympathetic Scottish crown and the benefits that would bring them. In 1333, troops loyal to Balliol were aided by the English army to fight the Kingdom of Scotland at Halidon Hill. As soon as the English secured a beachhead, Edward Balliol declared himself King of Scotland and immediately ceded the entire territory of Lothian to the English crown as homage. He moved back and forth between the north of England and Scotland, particularly at the fascinating Pendragon Castle, entertained by the Norman Vaupont family in 1333. His time in Scotland lasted less than a year, with almost yearly incursions afterwards into Scotland from the English borders, never able to muster troops who could do anything but destroy the surrounding countryside. He had been ousted at least 3 times by 1336, finally returning for one final push a decade later, holding a small rump state in Galloway. Even so close to the border, his power diminished entirely by 1355. It's believed that he was buried underneath what is now the Doncaster Post Office, driven out of town by the true Scottish people. You can see why the de Soul's collaboration would have made them the most hated family in the Scottish borders. In the same place that the Balliols found some support in the mid-1300s, Galloway, along the western coast, is another border castle used by the border Reivers with a beautiful legend, built in the shadow of Trustees Hill. Trustees Hill, an ancient vitrified fort, is believed now to be the capital of the ancient Celtic kingdom of Raiged. Cardonness Castle was owned by the MacCulloch clan in the late 13th century. A story was written in the 1860s about the legend of how it came into their hands. A lord of Cardonness exhausted all of his resources building the castle, and to recoup his loss, he joined the border raids. This unnamed clansman, owner of the castle, was married for 20 years, and his wife birthed him 9 daughters, but he was so desperate for a son that he issued a threat. If the next child wasn't a boy, he pledged to drown her and 9 of her daughters in the loch, and nobody doubted his word. She birthed a boy, and the family went out on the frozen lake to celebrate. At the height of the partying, the ice gave way. The only survivor was the wife, who married into the MacCulloch clan, passing the castle on to them. The Debatable Lands is one of the most fascinating places, I think, in the world. For a long period of time, hundreds of years, it wasn't either in the realm of Scotland or of England. Nowadays, people expressing some national pride associate it with Scotland, but in reality, back in contemporary times, they viewed themselves as fiercely independent, fighting for the right to survive and the rights of their own families. It was only in relatively modern times that the English and Scottish crown agreed to set a border and laid it out with something called Scots Dyke, a berm of dirt which separated England from Scotland. The Scottish borders were finally delineated, and it ended the longest period of truly cowboy culture ever known in England's history.